Now I have to be still and smile.
You have to be a picture.
We are broadcasting.
Great. So welcome as people come in. We're just gonna let the numbers all kind of settle down and we'll get started in just a minute. Let's give it like 30 more seconds and then we'll get started. Okay, so why don't we begin? Welcome everybody and good evening. I hope you're all doing well in this crazy time that we're in right now. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Rory Picker-Nice and I'm the Executive Director of the Jewish Community Relations Council in St. Louis. And I'm honored to be joining this conversation tonight, facilitating really this conversation with my dear friends and colleagues. I'm grateful to the Israel Action Network and the Jewish Council for Public Affairs for co-sponsoring this program, and the Jewish Federation's Shema Listen series for always being such a great partner with us. And I want to also express my appreciation to Alyssa Banford, who works on our team at the JCRC, who's going to be here helping with some of the behind-the-scenes tech. So she's here and you can see her. Her screen will disappear in just a second, but you can always send her a chat if you have any technical difficulties or any particular questions. So thanks, Alyssa. I'm going to lay the foundation for our discussion, and then I'm going to ask our panelists some questions, and I'm going to also be welcoming questions from the audience. So questions can be submitted either through the Q&A box or in the chat feature, and we will be monitoring all questions. Alyssa will be helping me with that as well. So we will not be doing any raised hands or inviting people into, just because we only have an hour, and I know there's a lot we want to cover, so we're going to try to get through as much as we can. I may combine questions that are similar in the interest of time, and feel free to submit questions throughout the discussion. So before I give you some background on the context of how we're coming into this, I'm going to introduce the panelists. Their full bios are extensive, so for the sake of time, I've asked Alyssa to put it into the chat, so you can also kind of, read through that if there's a lull at all. But I'll say that Rabbi Andrea Goldstein has served Congregation Sher Emeth, the largest Reform synagogue in St. Louis, for the past 22 years. Rabbi Goldstein currently serves on the Union for Reform Judaism's Commission on Social Action, St. Louis's NCJW Advisory Council, and the Advisory Committee of the Robert P. Jacobs Jewish Fund for Human Needs. Her rabbinate is centered around the call for social justice and the cultivation of spiritual practices. And the Reverend Dr. Karen Denise Anderson served 3 congregations in St. Louis, the last of which was in the florissant Ferguson area of Missouri. And in 2019, she was assigned to First AME Fame Church in Las Vegas, Nevada, which we're still bitter about, and we're not going to talk too much about that. She's their first female senior pastor. She has served on various committees and boards on both the conference and 5th district levels of the African Methodist Episcopal Church. While in St. Louis, she served as the board president of Metropolitan Congregations United. A Gamaliel, I actually don't know how to say that. I know how to say that in the Hebrew way, but I don't know, there's like a different kind of English way, I guess. Sorry if I mispronounced that. Affiliate and a cabinet member of Interfaith Partnership of St. Louis. Prior to ministry, she spent more than 23 years in nursing and healthcare administration. So I'm really glad that you're both joining me tonight. And part of the impetus for this is a trip that we did together actually just a little bit over a year ago. And so I want to use that. That's actually going to be the launching point of our conversation. So we're going to give some context for the trip, and then I'm going to jump in with some questions for both of you. So as many people here know, I think we're all well familiar with some of the background, having lived in St. Louis. In August of 2014, Michael Brown Jr. was fatally shot by a police officer in Ferguson. And those events, we're not going to go into all of the details. That in of itself is a whole conversation that we can have. But what launched from there were months of protests and civil unrest that really have, I think, just morphed into the modern day iteration of the conversations that were happening. Simultaneous to that, I think this is important in the context of it, that same summer, in the summer of 2014, 3 Israeli teenagers were kidnapped and ultimately were murdered by Hamas members. And that also, there were, the IDF responded, and again, I'm overgeneralizing, long history here, but we saw conflict on the border, the Israeli-Gazan border. And what we started to see also were then tweets that were going back and forth from protesters in Ferguson and protesters, or Palestinian protesters, that then kind of launched this conversation, this hashtag from Ferguson to Palestine. Right, there was this sort of alignment in causes. And so simultaneous to all of this going on, there were groups that were here locally within St. Louis that were getting active, clergy who were showing up on the streets. In particular, a group of women that started to get to know each other on the streets and then to gather together, first doing a Torah study together once a week, and then over time, the conversation started to morph. And because there was this relationship, those conversations were able to go from studying the text of Exodus to conversations about what was happening, including what does this hashtag mean? What is this conversation of from Ferguson to Palestine? How do we understand it? What's the broader context of this debate that seems to be taking place in certain circles, and also doesn't seem to be taking place in other circles? We started talking about whether or not we could actually travel together and do some exploration for ourselves. And so, and we did. That trip ultimately took place in the spring of 2019 last year. For a variety of reasons, it took us a while to get there. Just a few notes about the trip. So as you might have deduced, I helped to organize the trip. I was part of the trip. And so I'm not an unbiased moderator here, but I am going to do my best to allow our panelists to share their perspectives more. We were able to take the trip because of a generous grant from the Jewish Federation of St. Louis, and I am grateful to them for their support and their constant partnership. In applying for the grant, I said to the committee chair that this trip was to take a group of people who are committed to learning about Israel and the Palestinian territories to learn more. I said explicitly that I wasn't promising that people were going to come back as Zionists, but I can guarantee that they would come back having deeply engaged with the complexities of the region and the conflict, and with language to talk more. The trip was unlike anything that I've ever done before. It did not follow a particular narrative. I told the group that my goal was to have as many conversations as were humanly possible. And we tried to just meet with as many people and listen to as many stories as we could. It was not like any other trip that I'd even participated in. It was hard for me to let go of some of my own biases, to just accept that people were going to see what they were going to see, that we were not giving a particular narrative to the story. And part of that was really intentional, because I knew that part of the trust that we had built in the conversations meant that I needed to just give people the tools and let them come to their own conclusions, and they needed to be as unfiltered as possible. And that I would damage the trust if I tried to give only one side of any particular story. That would actually damage the relationship and the honesty that we had built. And I also knew that wherever they ended up at the end, I could like it or not like it, but I knew that it would not be because I had biased anything or hidden anything from anyone. So with that as a long introduction for all of it, I'm going to turn to our panelists now, and I'm going to start with you, Reverend Anderson, and ask you why you decided to go on the trip. What made you agree to it?
Good evening, Rory, and all those who are listening in, and thank you for having me always. Um, so I'm going to give my easy, quick answer uh, because I was going with people I trusted. It's that simple. I was going with people that I had built a relationship with and whom I trusted. And as a Christian, most of us from the time we're young dream of going to the Holy Land, going and walking where Jesus walked and seeing all of the places. And yes, that was on my bucket list to do. Uh, but this opportunity presented itself. And rather than just going as a tourist, and as sometimes happens in tourist places, you get the tourist tour. I went because this would be a learning experience. I could learn in community with people I trusted to share various viewpoints, which was the most important thing about being on the trip. Yes, it was important for us to put our feet in the Sea of Galilee, which we did. And it was important that I got to see the Dead Sea and see if I could really sink to the bottom, which I could not. Um, but most importantly, I went because I was going with a group of women who I had come to develop a very close relationship with, a learning relationship, because the way we started was studying text together. And so I felt what better way to go than to go with people that I trusted and to be able to experience, I don't know if this is the right way to say it, not from the side that we show the world, but from the backside. And so that's what I wanted to do.
Rabbi Goldstein, why did you show up in Ferguson?
Well, in some ways it's a little bit of the opposite of what Pastor Karen just shared, in that it was sort of a leap of faith in going, in that I felt the need to be there. I think at one point I said I felt called. I don't want to like overemphasize things, like I didn't hear a voice telling me, but I did feel like an ethical, moral mandate, a pull to be with people who were simply, from what I experienced and heard and understood, trying to, claim their right to speak their minds and protest injustice that seemed incredibly clear and obvious to them. When I say it was a little bit the opposite, what I mean is I didn't really know many people who were going, and I wasn't going with a group of people that I trusted. And from such a tragedy, from such a horrific tragedy that befell Michael Brown and his family on a very personal level, and what that sparked in the community, what I found was a community of people who really were there trying to look out for one another and work for a more just world. And so I came away from those experiences with partners who I came to trust implicitly with everything, with like my vulnerabilities and my fears and my questioning and my thoughts, and partners with whom I could struggle and wrestle. And that was unexpected. But the original reason is that, I was taught from the time I was very young. I think I've shared this in multiple platforms before, but my dad was born in Germany, in Bergen-Belsen, in a DP camp. And from his parents' experiences, what they taught him about Judaism was that Judaism means that you stand with the oppressed and you stand with people who cannot stand on their own. In Ferguson, everybody was standing on their own really well, and they deserved the support of the greater community. I felt that was an expression of my Judaism to be there.
Reverend Anderson, why did you show up at the protests?
Well, actually, it aligns very much with what Rabbi Andrea said. I think I mentioned, or I've shared with you all, number one, I'm a baby boomer. And so I grew up in the era of the civil rights movement, but at a time where I was really too young to participate in it, where I watched it from a television screen. I remember the day that Dr. King was shot. I think I shared that I was on an 8th grade trip to Washington, D.C., and how we had been to all the wonderful monuments and got back that evening to find out he had been killed, and spent the next 3 days in a hotel. I remember always asking myself as I grew up, would I have had the courage to stand in the places that so many stood, whether it was John Lewis on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, whether it was the 4 young men from North Carolina A&T University who sat in at the Woolworths in Greensboro, North Carolina. Would I have had the courage to be a freedom rider, riding the buses through places where I knew it was a great possibility that I would not come back? Would I have had the courage of Diane Nash, or, and never thinking I'd have to answer that question for myself. Because of course, after Dr. King, we're all happy about it and we're moving forward until Michael Brown. And coming back from a conference, clergy conference, I'm in the airport and I see on the screen, Ferguson, Missouri. I see this crowd of people and I didn't know what was going on, only to get home and learn of this young man who was laying in the streets. And kind of like Rabbi Andrea, it was a pull, it was a tug to be present, to be on the streets with young people, to stand in solidarity with them, but had to learn, because we did it wrong in the beginning. We tried to, as adults, tried to tell them how to run their movement. And this is the way you do it. And they like, we have a plan and we just really need you to show up. And I had to be there because I am an African-American mother and I raised an African-American son. And I've shared with you too that where many don't have to worry about whether their children will reach adulthood. As an African-American mom, I did. I worried about him from the time he could go somewhere on his own, all through high school. We lived in a wonderful neighborhood. He went to private school. He got wonderful grades. He had scholarship monies. But anytime he drove my car, and depending on the neighborhood, he got pulled over. I never knew what was going to happen. And when he was in college, and I was on my way to Texas and got a call because he got pulled over because somebody said he looked like someone who had committed a crime in his college town. And I didn't know anybody, and they took him and he was in jail. And I'm trying to find out where he is and what's going on. It could have turned out so much worse. I'm so grateful to God that he's getting ready to celebrate 37 years, but I could have been Tamir Rice's mom, or Michael Brown's mom, or Jordan Davis's mom. It could have been my child. And so that moment called me to make a decision. Would I stay in my church? Would I stay in my house? Or would I go out and say enough is enough? And the answer was enough was enough.
Thank you for sharing that. Rabbi Goldstein, what went through your mind when you heard the chants from Ferguson to Palestine, or hearing about the platform of the movement for Black Lives?
Well, so I had context to understand that there had been, through social media, there had been a relationship that had been formed between a lot of the activists in Ferguson and many of the Palestinian protesters in Palestine and Gaza, based on information that was being shared about how to resist, military tactics that the police were pulling out, including tanks and tear gas in Ferguson. And so I have to say it made like logical sense to me. Like I did understand why that became a phrase and like what it was rooted in. it made me be reflective about wondering and asking questions about where the organized Jewish community was during Ferguson. There were definitely individual Jews, clergy, and many lay people, individual Jews, who showed up on the streets consistently. But the organized Jewish community was not present in any way. And, you know, in many ways, you know, in our sort of Jewish bubble, was very resistant to what they saw happening, you know, on their TV screens. And so it made sense to me, this understanding of this sense of two peoples who are feeling, experiencing oppression. And, you know, to me, it was a call to figure out how to, you know, double down and be more supportive and figure out how to bring the Jewish community along in being present. First and foremost, because I think it's the right thing to do, but B, so that we could begin to do what Pastor Karen is talking about in terms of developing relationships, so that we could start to have conversation, you know, not mandates, conversation about where our interests intersect, where they might differ, and how we can still work together, even, you know, even across differences. And so that was my reaction.
And sorry, I just knocked my table over. Reverend Anderson, what was your reaction when you heard the chants of From Ferguson to Palestine?
So when I'm 100% honest, I like Rabbi Andrea. It made sense. I mean, it made sense, because here was the thing: nobody was helping young people understand how do you protect yourself against a militarized action. How do you protect yourself against tear gas? How do you protect yourself when tanks are staring you down? And so young people were hearing from young people. And I don't know that it was, well, let me just, this is where we want to go with it. There was really no anti-Semitic sentiments in the streets. It was just, we're getting help from Palestine and they're going through what we're going through. And I think that part of that just has to do with lack of understanding and lack of relationships. We have to begin to have conversation. We can't avoid conversation. And so in the conversations that we had, where I learned a lot more, my understanding and my perspective could grow. And I think that was the beauty of this trip. We didn't always agree at the end of the day about what should be happening, but at least I can say that I saw both sides of the argument and both sides where people's hearts were. And I think that's the key, is we have to learn where people's hearts are. And it wasn't everybody. I mean, the reality is it's never everybody. There's always going to be some, but it's never going to be the totalness of any movement or any organization. There's always going to be some who have a particular perspective. But what I think helped was the fact that there were Jewish people who continued to show up, who were in the streets, and who did not let that turn them around and did not let them stop being present. And I think that that's what helped move us from a place where it could have been extremely antagonistic, but it wasn't. And you didn't feel that when you were on the streets. You didn't feel in opposition. You didn't see people saying, oh, there are Jewish people here, send them away. You know, every time I think about the marches and the reception, what I always think about is KB leading the marches and drumming for us. You know, and wearing everything that said, yes, I am a Jewish male of faith, standing with you. And I think that's where we have to get, is not understanding that there are differences, understanding that there are differences, and understanding that the only way we transcend differences is through relationship building and dialogue. And sometimes the conversations are hard, and sometimes the conversations are uncomfortable. And sometimes we're going to be frustrated because people are not going to see our point of view, which to me is no different than having arguments with people over the moniker of Black Lives Matter. And having to hear people say, oh, well, we can't say that because all lives matter. The reality is Black Lives Matter has never denied the sanctity of life for anyone, but it has said that until our lives matter as much as everybody else's, then we have to keep yelling it. And we've been yelling it since 1619. That somebody would recognize and acknowledge that Black Lives Matter. From the time we came over, placed in shackles, we've been saying that we are more than 3/5 of a human being, that we are fully human with every desire to be fully recognized with dignity and worth.
I'm so grateful for all your sharing and for the vulnerability that you're bringing, both of you, to this conversation. And so with the experiences that you've had, with everything that we've talked about, I wonder if you'd respond specifically to some of the questions that that we've been hearing from people who, I think there's been a wide range of questions. There's those who say, I want to support Black Lives Matter, but I don't feel like I can because it's either anti-Israel or it's anti-Semitic, or people who say, who maybe don't even say I want to support Black Lives Matter because they feel so unwelcome into that space. And so I wonder, and I'll kind of open this up. So Reverend Anderson, you look like you'll jump into that. But how to respond? And I think just because I want to also name the fact that both of you have been deeply immersed in this work, and I think oftentimes that question is coming from those who have not gone, they haven't taken that step to walk through the door, because they're scared to walk through that door, because there's a discomfort and a fear of, am I at risk for walking through that door because this space is not for me?
So yeah, I was sitting here thinking about that when you said that, Rory. So in so many words, it's like this: fear keeps us from some of our greatest achievements. Fear keeps us from some of our most precious relationships, right? Again, it's real clear I'm an African-American female. And if just because places were not welcoming to me, I didn't go, I would have missed out on half of my life, honestly. I'm just honest, sometimes you have to walk into the places where you are most afraid. If it was only about Black Lives Matter, I don't think that African Americans as a whole would fight so hard for democracy. And we've been fighting so hard for democracy, even when democracy has not fought for us. I'll be honest, when democracy has not fought for us, we have fought for democracy. When we have not been viewed as human, we still fought. We fought for the right to vote. We fought for the right to live in certain areas, even though democracy allowed for redlining and to put us in areas where we didn't necessarily have equal access. And so sometimes when you're most afraid, you have to do like getting in a swimming pool. You just jump in. I have learned that when you try and walk down the steps to get in a pool, you'll stop and start about 10 times because the water's cold. Sometimes you just jump off the edge, and when you come up, you realize it's not as frightening or as cold as you think it is. It's frightening even to sit on this call, because I don't know how people will perceive what I'm going to say. It was frightening in many boardrooms that I sat in where I would be the only face that looked like me. But reality is the only way that we move forward is together. Dr. King once said, none of us can be free until all of us are free. And that to me is the heart of all of what we do. We just want freedom for everyone. Rabbi Andrea stepped into the water. She picked up a phone one day and she said, would you have coffee with me? And I said, of course. We didn't know each other, you know, but it was one coffee that turned into 2 or 3 coffees that has turned into one of my most precious friendships. And the first time she said, would you come to the synagogue and would you speak? I almost passed out on the floor. I don't know that I mean, I was like, are you kidding? You want me to do what? But you step out and you trust that when you step out for the right reasons, when you step out for justice, when you step out for righteousness, when you step out because people are hurting, it will come with a good end. I just believe that with my whole heart. I'm going to let Rabbi Andrea go from there.
Yeah, it's hard for me to sort of say anything more after you said that. I feel I can only speak to my experience, which has been that it to be in spaces where people are talking about Black Lives Matter has not felt personally threatening to me. It hasn't felt threatening as a Jewish person to me. And at least in St. Louis, the one time when it did become threatening to a member of the Jewish clergy, to Rabbi Talvi, the response from the activists on the ground, a threat came to her from like 3 individual people, and the response from the activists on the ground was so swift and so unequivocal that's not okay, that we don't call people out in that way, and that we stand together. So I haven't had like traumatizing experiences with this to understand people's fear. I think it's like a fear of the unknown, Rory, sort of as to what you were saying, or a perceived fear as opposed to something that is actual. That doesn't mean that everybody thinks the same way, and that doesn't mean that there aren't challenges to the current political administration in Israel and how Israel is behaving when people are looking at systems of oppression. But that's okay. It's okay to have conversations where we disagree, and it's okay to have conversations where we push one another to think differently about the world. I think it's not okay to walk away or to not even, as Karen said, try, just because we perceive that what we value and believe in so strongly is not going to be held up in the exact same way as we hold it. We're able to work together with lots of groups where we don't see eye to eye on every single thing. So it's hard for me to understand what the particular resistance is in this issue, when the issue is so pressing for our nation right now as a whole. The structural racism in this country is damaging. It's so damaging to all of us, and I do believe that we can come together in ways that actually, sort of to paraphrase Karen, paraphrasing Dr. King, right? Like we're also all broken in our different ways, but coming together in that brokenness and in that pain and in that suffering, that's where we start to find wholeness again. And so that's what I've discovered, sort of in this journey together. And being with all of you, like being with the sisters, that's the place where I find the most hope. And it's not the place where we're all on the same page all the time, but I think this is where we started, right? It is the same place where we've grown because of the work we've done together in trust of one another. And so yeah.
I'm really struck, and I want to really lift up what I'm hearing you both say, and I'm really struck, particularly Pastor Karen, with what you're talking about of like all of the uncomfortable places, and you were sharing so much of your own narrative, and it was just causing me to reflect on not necessarily my personal narrative, but just Jewish history of, like I've been really fortunate to grow up in an America in the age in which I have, where I grew up kind of after the separate hospitals and separate colleges and country clubs and things like that, right? But there were eras where that was also what the Jewish community was doing, was putting ourselves into places that are uncomfortable. And so that's really interesting to sit with, of like, what do we even mean? Like, what does it even mean to be comfortable, right? Like, what is the luxury and the privilege that comes with comfort? And I'm really reflecting also, as the person who, brought you onto a plane and brought you to a country where you don't speak the language and had never been, right, where I had been countless times, and I knew what to expect when we got there, and you had no idea what to expect. I'm sure that couldn't have been comfortable either, to have, and I also knew that they would speak plenty of English, but I don't know if you knew that when we started off. And so I really want to sit with that, and I think with that, try to maybe take a step back to say, if we can help unpack for some people, like, how did we get to that point, right? What is the process of relationship building? I know you mentioned that those initial coffee dates, but right, there was a lot that happened between those coffee dates to being willing to get on an airplane, and not even just get on an airplane, but I feel the need to just name, because we haven't always like totally talked about it. Like, our flight was about to get canceled. You remember, like, we all called each other and managed to get to the airport within like 30 minutes or some, like, like, we all just showed up with like whatever we had packed. And right, so like, how did we get there?
Oh, that is hilarious. That was so funny. We got those texts. We gotta go. The plane is getting ready to go. Again, I think for me, there was no fear of going, because again, I went with people I trusted. I went with people who I felt that if I didn't understand, would take the time to help me understand what was going on. I went because one of the promises was that we would hear both sides. And so, sitting and having a Shabbat dinner and having wonderful conversation at the table, and hearing a young college student talk to us about his thoughts, and even his thoughts on what Black Lives Matter meant to him, was so powerful. I think there was a moment where we all had tears in our eyes sitting at that table. And then we went and we had dinner with a Muslim family at the end of, my mind just blanked out. Ramadan, was that where we ended up? Yes.
Yeah, it was the end of Ramadan when we were there.
Thank you. And we went and had this wonderful meal and met this wonderful family. And the thing that is just so imprinted on my heart is that, in honesty, all anybody really wants is to be able to live. I honestly mean that. And it's the same thing I feel in this country. All people want is to be able to live and to be seen and to be valued. I saw places that hurt my heart. I'll be honest. There were places when we went through Palestine that hurt my heart, because honestly, some of them didn't look a lot different than the inner city of St. Louis. I'm just being real. And I saw people in some of the same poverty that I see in the inner city, where buildings are boarded up and weeds are growing wild and people don't have enough. And so, yes, I have to admit there were a lot of mixed feelings. We did go to the Holocaust Museum, and I think I cried through most of it. And when we got to the children's part, I was just a basket case, because I can never wrap my head around humankind's inhumanity to one another. But I'll also say that it was the same way I felt when I went to the Apartheid Museum in South Africa. It's how I felt when I went through the Civil Rights Museum in Memphis. And I think that's why the conversation, I think that's why relationships are so doggone important, because the reality is there are common threads that run through our inhumanity as well as our humanity. We saw people working on both sides to bring together an end that would be beneficial to everybody. And so I think those were the powerful moments. Our guide, there were moments she struggled, because where you, Rory, had committed to not trying to, change anybody's mind, she was determined to bring us all over to the, to her piece. And we were like, yeah, we're not here for that. Or some of the conversations we had, she struggled with, and some of them we struggled with. And so I'll share what you said the other day. A bottle of wine at the end of the day always helps. It helps to have honest conversations. But the reason we could have them is because we trusted each other. And we trusted that even if we did not agree, we might get to a place where we could still move forward together and not turn back from one another. And I think that's what was most important to me.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say this. I think, that trip was really different because it was not based on what we saw so much as to who we met. And it was based on the stories that they told us about the truth of their lives. And we made this commitment to sort of hold everybody's truth as sacred. And when we did that, what I think, for me anyway, what you found was like pain is pain is pain. And there's like the two sides, I know they're very real, but they're also like constructs, right? And, how did Karen and I forge a friendship? I'll say it was like pretty easy from an interpersonal perspective because we're pretty nice people. But it wasn't easy from a structural point of view. I mean, I lived in St. Louis for 16 years before I was able to develop this kind of friendship with a woman from a different part of town than I was used to being in. And, I've said this before, that's not like by happenstance, right? There were systems in place that designed St. Louis to look the way it looks so that certain races live in certain places and, never the twain shall meet unless you really want to will it to be so. And it leads to this us and them, which is really a false narrative on so many levels. Like Rory, you and I have talked many, many, many times that Black Lives Matter is a Jewish movement as well. We have Jews of color in our community for whom this movement is vital, and saying these words is vital and life-giving. And I'm just really resistant into buying into to reinforcing this two sides part of the story. I'm much more, especially since that trip, I'm trying to hold, where people are suffering and what people of privilege and who have some power can do to leverage that privilege and power to alleviate some suffering. And those people can have all different colored skins and be all different kinds of religions on both sides of that story. But I think the more we can get into spaces where we can come together in that way, I mean, that's the tipping point. That's when we begin to work towards change, and it stops feeling like an us-them situation, and it starts feeling like how do we make our community better for all of us? Because my life was far worse when Karen was not in it. And my congregation's life was far worse than before when we did not have a relationship with Ward Chapel AME. It is better now. Yeah. In measurable ways. So.
And I wanted to say that is that what we did was we began with the two of us, and then we decided that what we were learning and what we were doing together was so important that we wanted to bring our two diverse congregations together. And so it started with that speaking for Dr. King, and then it was an inviting Andrea's synagogue to come to my church to worship, and then it was sitting down around tables with food. Food makes such a wonderful way to talk. We sat around food and we had dialogues about what is your tradition and what is our tradition. And we even took one day and had a text, and it was so funny to watch our two congregations look at this Exodus text and both want to take total ownership. And, you know, I mean, it was just fascinating. We went to a play together that talked about race. We went to the exhibit that was at the Missouri History Museum that talked about race in St. Louis. And we took both congregations and we sat down and they talked to each other. And people built relationships to the point where they still communicate with one another. We got to the point where we said, let's develop a freedom Seder that celebrates both cultures. So sometimes it's as simple, it doesn't have to be a major movement. It's people coming together to get to know one another. And it's holding everybody's stories as sacrosanct. Everybody's story is real because it is their lived existential experience that I don't have a right to deny, right? I don't have a right to deny your story, but no one has a right to deny mine or the way we live. And we laugh because talking about that moment, in our first conversation when it was a person from my congregation, African American, they're like, well, you know, our story is the Exodus story and how we got brought out of slavery. And somebody from the synagogue is like, that's not your story, that's our story. And then we had to have conversation around how it became for both of us the story of liberation, the story of freedom from oppression. And then I think Andrea remembers one of our members after the story in St. Louis, the trip to the History Museum, and one of my people saying, well, the only thing I knew about Jewish people was the fact that they kept running me out of their stores when I was little. And so I've never cared for Jewish people. We don't know what experiences lead to why people think the way they do. And the only way we change that is through dialogue. And Rory, if you don't mind, I saw one question I just have to answer really quickly because it asked me, what is success and freedom to Black Lives Matter? I don't speak for Black Lives Matter. There's nobody who can speak necessarily because we are not a monolithic group. I can tell you what freedom looks like to me. Freedom to me looks like the time when my children have as much access where I don't have to worry about over-policing, when my grandson gets to be of age and drives a car. What it looks like is where resources are poured. I don't live in St. Louis anymore, but when resources are equitably distributed north of the Del Mar Divide, just like they are south of the Del Mar Divide, that's what freedom looks like to me. Freedom looks like when I
Uh-oh.
I think we froze.
Oh.
Okay, well, we'll give her a second to come back and we'll pick up. Well, but apologies for internet difficulties, but I want to really jump off, right? So with this idea, Rabbi Andrea, there's a question to you actually, right? As we're talking about freedom, how do we understand free Palestine not meaning anti-Israel or anti-Semitic?
I want a free Palestine. I'm a Jewish rabbi. I want Palestine I want the Palestinian people to have self-determination and to be able to share freedom in their own country. And I want it in a way that's safe for the Palestinians and for Israelis. But I don't see those two words together as anything threatening to a Jewish person. And I would be questioning why that would be threatening. As someone asked me a similar question one time, like, how can you go when people are waving Palestinian flags? Like they're flags at the protest. And I want for the Palestinian people to have their own country with their own flag. I don't have any problem with that. And I don't see that as antithetical to what I want for my own people and for Israel. I think Israelis should want there to be a free, healthy, safe Palestine too. Everything has context, but those two words together by themselves, I'm embracing of them. I think.
I thought we had Karen back, but I think we lost her again. So no, she's had some difficulties. We've actually been privileged to continue doing our study together, and it's not infrequent that she pops off and pops back in. So, I will give her a chance to finish her thoughts when she comes back. But in the meantime, I wonder if you can start to reflect on particularly like what are the ways in which you think that this story is different because all of those of us involved are women. Somebody asked particularly about female clergy in terms of being able to create these productive relationships between and through and around institutions that are trying to block this work.
I think just you should chime in too. You're part of this. I think sort of one of the particulars that I would say about this, Karen, we're talking about our bond as women. And I do think,
and then you're gonna finish your answer because we want to hear what
I have no idea where I was. This internet out here some days. Jeez, Louisa. Okay, I'm sorry.
We're talking about freedom.
Oh, freedom. Freedom from this internet would be kind of a good thing right about now. No. Yeah, so I think that's what it looks like to me. It's that idea that Dr. King put out there about a beloved community where it doesn't matter the color of my skin or any of that, that all people are equal in this thing, and that we find ways to build bridges with one another. We find ways to connect our common stories and our bonds, and that justice is for everyone. Success looks to me like when the prison industrial system is not looking the way it looks right now, where the people who make up 13% of the population of the nation make up 80% of the prisons. That's what it looks like to me. Now, what was the part about women?
Amen. Rory was asking, like, is there something unique about the fact that the six of us are women? And the one thing that I'll just reflect on about that is that I do think, especially in thinking back and thinking about Michael Brown in particular, the notion that we're women and we're mothers, and looking at Michael Brown as a mother's child, and not talking the way the news media was talking about, like, what was he doing beforehand, and he's a big guy, and this, that, and the other thing. Our framework, which you did not hear a lot about through the media, was that of a parent, in particular a mother, and I think again that sort of cuts through the who, what, where, when, why, how, and gets to the heart of things, and it just allows for sort of like a breakdown of things that could be barriers, just stop being barriers when we talk about things in that light. Do you remember that?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I do remember that. And I think it's so important because, again, as an African-American female, what I really want is for people to see my children as children. I want, I don't understand how you see 10-year-olds and imagine them being 20-year-olds. I don't even understand how you see an 18-year-old and right now here in this in the state of Missouri, I saw they're trying to, put 12-year-olds in prison. That's absolutely beyond anything I can imagine. Children should be allowed to make some mistakes and not have to give their life for it, right? My children, I should not have to worry that my 8-year-old cute grandson, by the time he's 12, is going to be looked at like he's an absolutely grown man, because he's not. He'll be a child who's going to make if everything that we did and made mistakes, that we were either locked up or our lives were taken for it, none of us would be here. So, you know, as an African American mother, that's all about freedom. That's about having people see my child as still cute and adorable. And we saw these, I'm telling you, when I saw those young people on the streets, I saw my son. I saw his friends. And that's who I saw every time I went there, is these young people who were just asking for a chance to become adults. It's that simple. And it wasn't about whether he was the best kid or whether he had made some mistakes. He was a kid. And the reality is some of us made some terrible mistakes, and we didn't start getting our lives together to somewhere around 30 or 40 years of age, but we had a chance to grow up. And it was important. And I think the other thing about being women is the fact that we do want to sometimes take the time to listen. You know, we're more willing to back up just a step or two and admit, maybe I don't have all the answers and maybe I don't know everything. And we're willing to do the work. The reality is the relationships we have, it sounds easy, you all, I know it does, but relationships take work. You have to be willing to commit to doing the hard work to build a relationship and to sticking in that relationship, even when it's not easy.
Even when it's not easy, and even when it's not convenient, right? That's
Yes.
I'm mindful. We're getting close to the end of our time, and I think both of you, I think, maybe even had places that you needed to run off to, and so I want to start to wrap us up, really just pulling out some of the main points that you've said, but also with kind of a plug for the questions we weren't able to get to. There's other opportunities, so don't run off just yet. But you know, I think what I'm really carrying with me, I think, in this conversation, and I did the trip with you, but I still always learn from the both of you. You know, I think there's part of the challenge that we often feel sometimes is this fear in these relationships. I think that fear is often heightened in moments of tragedy. And I also think moments of tragedy are actually the places when you can actually step in sometimes most easily, right? Like I think, like, just kind of as humans, right, we often get really uncomfortable, like, you know, when somebody passes away and like we don't know what to say to them, or somebody's really sick, right? We don't like to, like, right, those are the moments people get really uncomfortable. But those are also the places when like nobody sort of looks at you funny. Like I feel like you know, if somebody like brings you a platter of food because someone is in the hospital, no one's like, that was weird, we're not close friends. Like, people are just like, that's so great that you showed up, right? Like, those are actually the easiest moments, right? If it was a random Tuesday, people would be like, that's odd, right? But like, it's actually in these difficult moments that you actually can do this outreach, even when it makes us the most uncomfortable. And the rewards can be so much greater because it's also, I think, sometimes the deepest relationships come from places of vulnerability. And that's what I think also both of you really highlighted for us today. And that's what I want to really appreciate most of all. I mean, I know you can't see everybody else that's on here, but you know they're there. And that's incredibly scary. And to share yourself so openly, I know, because I get to spend time with you, that this is what your conversations sound like, even without a bunch of people listening in. For the most part, you know, I mean, that this is really how you both would speak to each other, and these are really the questions that you would grapple with. And so I'm so grateful for you both for modeling it, for showing us that, and for the reminder that we don't have to wait for the work to become convenient before we start. And it's actually when we start the work that we can make the work convenient, right? The whole point of the work is that it's not easy and it's not convenient, and I think that's the call to action for all of us. I want to just name, there was a couple of questions, particularly around Jews in the civil rights movement and kind of the break between Jewish involvement in the civil rights movement. And so we'll send out a follow-up email to people, but we are going to be hosting 2 really great talks with a professor from San Francisco State University named Mark Dollinger, who has literally written the book. He has this great book called Black Power, Jewish Politics, in which he talks about the interaction between the Jewish and Black communities. And he does talk also about how, in even saying that, we're erasing Black Jews, and so what we need to do to even have that conversation, and ways that our communities have also been closer and further apart at various points in history. And I know there were also some questions about ways that racial equity work is happening today, and if that's different than it was before. And I'm going to just jump in to say, I think it is different partially, and it can still be different because we're still writing the chapter on that. And so I know that I'll just name Congregation Sheremet because Rabbi Andrea is right here. I know you've been doing a lot of different programs for the Jewish community. We have the Jewish Committee for Racial Equity, Jewish Coalition for Racial Equity, that's bringing together our Jewish community to get involved in this work. And so we'll send a follow-up email to get more involved with all of that if you're interested. But I think, and I'll let you each just say a final word, but what I'm taking from both of you is you just have to start showing up somewhere.
Yeah. And I think Karen already said, like, it's almost always worth it. It's almost always worth it. And
Yeah.
I mean, for people who are watching who don't really know Reverend Anderson well, Reverend Anderson has consistently shown up for the Jewish community, consistently. She was in Sher Emeth after the Tree of Life synagogue shooting. She was at the JCC. She left a conference that she was at to come to the JCC community gathering after Pittsburgh. She was able to be there for like literally 15 minutes. She walked in to show that she was doing that, which brought me to tears. And so, I think around all of the discomfort or worry or anxiety that might be around, I think now is the time for the Jewish community to really mobilize and show up there's a variety of ways to do this. It doesn't have to be at protests, but to really figure out how to show up in an organized way in ways that matter for all members of the Black community, Jews and non-Jews and Muslims. This is the moment, and we should seize upon it. It's a different time than it was 6 years ago. We're in a different place, and I look forward to working with everyone in the community together to do that.
Yeah, I agree. Just find a way to show up. And as Rabbi said, it may not be in the streets, but it may be in the way that you vote. It may be in the way that you talk in your personal circle of justice and racism. Honestly, it doesn't have to be big. It can be one-on-one, having conversation with someone to help shift negative imagery and negative stereotypes that have been out for so very long. And just understanding that when it gets down to it, whether you're Jewish, whether you're Christian, believe it, I can't say that, but at the basis of our faiths is justice. It's believing in a just God and a system of justice for all people. And that's all we're talking about, and building relationships so that you move from casual coffee to deep respect and love. Where I have sisters. I don't think they're friends. They're really sisters, because I know in my heart that if I ever needed, that they would be right there for me. And that's the reason I show up. It's the reason I showed up, because I didn't have to say or do. I just needed them to know that they were on my heart. And that's what I hope, not just for me. I really do this work for my grandchildren. I used to want to say doing it for my kids, but right now, where we are, I do it for my grandchildren. I want to leave them a better world. I don't want them to go through this. I want them to feel comfortable in the spaces where they can be, because their intellect or their personalities carry them. I want them to grow up, and I want them to have a diverse group of friends from everywhere. Because this is the last part, one of the things on this trip, when you increase your worldview, you realize some of that stuff you held on to was not worth it in the first place. When you increase your worldview, the things that troubled you and you stressed out about it, they don't matter. The differences are so small, and the connectivity is so large that you can find a place of common ground in all of this. So I appreciate the opportunity to come and just share with my sisters and to talk like we talk to one another.
Thank you both so much. I'm sure I'll talk to you tomorrow. And thank you, thank you everyone else for joining us. I hope everyone stays safe, stay healthy, and we look forward to many more discussions with all of you. Have a good night.
Have a good one. Take care, everybody. Love you.